Not all monsters hide in the dark. Some blend in, build families, live ordinary lives. Until the people who trust them disappear. Here, I tell their stories. Today we're going to talk about an Austrian man named Josef Fritzl. For 24 years he kept his daughter Elisabeth hidden in the basement of his home. How was it possible for a man to conceal such a secret for so long? Did his wife ever suspect anything? What kind of life did Elisabeth and her children endure underground? How did they manage to escape, and what became of them after their release? On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old girl was admitted to a hospital in the small Austrian town of Amstetten. She was in critical condition. Her body convulsed in spasms, her kidneys were failing, her skin was unnaturally pale, and her blood oxygen level was dangerously low. Doctors placed her into a medically induced coma and connected her to dialysis and a ventilator. The girl had no documents with her, no identification, no medical records, no trace of who she was. Her name, the doctors learned, was Kerstin Fritzl. Information provided by the elderly man who had brought her in. The hospital staff, annoyed, suspicious, contacted the police. The man explained that earlier that morning he had heard a strange noise coming from his yard. When he went outside, he found a frail, emaciated young woman lying there. She had with her a handwritten note bearing her name and a plea for urgent medical help. According to him, the note was written by her mother, his daughter, Elisabeth, who had allegedly run away many years earlier, joined a religious cult, and occasionally sent her parents short letters. After answering the officer's questions, the man left, saying that his family was waiting for him at home. Kerstin's condition continued to deteriorate, but without any background information, no history, no diagnosis. The doctors could do little to help her. The only person who might have been able to provide answers was her mother. And so, the police decided to take an unusual step. They made a public appeal, addressing Elisabeth Fritzl directly through national television, asking her to contact the doctors. At the same time, they quietly reopened the investigation into her disappearance, a case that had been cold for more than 2 decades. In one of her last letters, Elisabeth had written to her parents about Kerstin's illness and her intention to return home soon. The letter had been postmarked from Carmarthen an der Krems, a town just 70 kilometres from Amstetten. But when investigators checked, no one there had ever seen Elisabeth, her daughter, or any sign of the supposed cult. 3 days later, detectives reached out to Manfred Wolfhart, an expert on sects and cult behaviour. They showed him Elisabeth's letter and the note found with Kerstin. The specialist found no clues that could reveal where the 2 women might have been living all these years. But something about the text disturbed him. The phrasing was precise, unnaturally so, as if each sentence had been carefully constructed under supervision. Wolfhart concluded that Elisabeth had written these messages under coercion, dictated by someone else. Meanwhile, Austrian television continued to air the story. Footage of a desperate father pleading for his missing daughter's return. For 24 years he had claimed to live in grief, convinced that she had been taken by a cult. Across the country, viewers watched his sorrow, unaware that the truth was far closer to home, hidden just beneath his feet. Let's start from the beginning. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in the town of Amstetten, Austria, to Josef Fritzl Sr. and Maria Nennig. His father was an alcoholic who cheated on his wife repeatedly, until one day she threw him out of the house when their son was 4 years old. Josef never saw him again. After the annexation of Austria, The elder Fritzl enlisted in the Wehrmacht and later died fighting for Nazi Germany in 1944. Maria was cruel to Joseph, subjecting him to both emotional and physical abuse. Family acquaintances would later say that the bruises on the boy's body never truly faded, and Joseph himself recalled a time when his mother kicked him over and over while he lay on the floor, bleeding. She called him the devil, a criminal, and she never hugged or kissed him. Yet every week she took him to church. None of this stopped Joseph from seeing her as the best woman in the world, strict only as much as she needed to be. He often spoke with admiration about how she had taught him discipline, order, and diligence. To support them both, Maria took on every kind of work she could find, and because of her determination, the boy was able to get an education. Joseph feared his mother when she was home, and felt no less anxious when she wasn't. That fear took root during the war years, when, during air raids, Maria would send him to the shelter while she stayed behind to guard the house. In that shelter, young Joseph struggled with panic, not knowing whether the bombing had ended or whether his mother was still alive. Little is known about Fritzl's school years. His classmates considered him withdrawn and unpopular, and they mocked his outdated haircut. At 16, Joseph entered a vocational college, where he trained as an electrical engineer. Despite his reserved and even somewhat shy nature, in his youth, Fritzl had several relationships, one of which, with a 17-year-old named Rosemary, eventually led to marriage. Joseph had always dreamed of a large family, and his chosen partner loved children just as much. Over the years, she gave birth to 3 sons and 4 daughters, devoting herself entirely to their upbringing. To make sure his family lacked nothing, Joseph worked tirelessly. He started at a steel foundry, then moved to a building materials company, and later became a traveling salesman, driving across the country selling industrial equipment. Fritzl always dressed elegantly, drove a Mercedes, and carried himself like a successful man. Employers and colleagues respected him and described him as hard-working. He was demanding of others, but equally demanding of himself, often working on weekends and holidays. He never liked to talk about his personal life. There were no family photographs on his desk, and no one at work even knew he was a father of many children. After Joseph's wedding, his mother moved in with the couple. With age, Maria grew softer and no longer shouted at her son. But over time, Joseph began to show the same cruelty toward her that she had once shown him. Following one of their many arguments, Joseph locked his mother in the attic and bricked up the windows. No one knows exactly how many years Maria spent in that confinement, but it's believed to have been close to 2 decades, and it likely ended only with her death. In 1967, the elegant engineer Joseph Fritzl was arrested on suspicion of assaulting a young woman. According to investigators, he had forced his way into the home of a 24-year-old nurse while her husband was at work and attacked her under threat. Fritzl was found guilty and sentenced to only 18 months in prison. It was likely during this time that he began to recognize the darker side of his impulses, thoughts that would later evolve into the idea of keeping someone entirely under his control. By April 1977, one of Fritzl's daughters, Elisabeth, had turned 11. By then, Joseph had already become dangerously fixated on the child. He left inappropriate materials near her belongings, crossed boundaries that no parent ever should, and over time his behavior grew progressively more disturbing. Elisabeth told no one. Like her older siblings, she feared her father and saw him as untouchable. Years later, she confided in a close friend and her friend's boyfriend, a young man who was renting a room in the Fritzl house at the time. He never went to the police, afraid of losing the place he was living. After these incidents, Elisabeth, already a shy girl, withdrew even more. Her father forbade her from spending time with friends or staying out after school, and few of her classmates were ever invited into the Fritzl home. Joseph disliked having strangers around. He saw Elisabeth as a difficult teenager. She had begun to go out to clubs, smoke, and drink. So, when she turned 15, he arranged a job for her as a waitress at a roadside cafe. That same year, Elisabeth ran away for the first time. She and a friend stayed in Vienna for about 3 weeks before police found them and brought them back home. No one asked why she had wanted to leave. After finishing school, Elisabeth found work in Linz, far from her family, and started planning to move out permanently. In 1978, Fritzl obtained an official permit to expand and reinforce the basement of his house. He told his wife and neighbours he was building a shelter, a precaution in case of a nuclear attack. During the Cold War, such a reason seemed entirely plausible. Austria bordered the socialist state of Yugoslavia, and civil defence shelters were common. The local council even approved a small grant to support the construction. The work took nearly 5 years, and when it was finished, inspectors visited the site, found no irregularities, and soon forgot about it. But Fritzl had only shown them a portion of what he had built. From the beginning, he knew that part of this new space would serve another purpose. He installed plumbing, electricity, a small sink, a stove, a refrigerator, and a bed. He soundproofed the walls. He was preparing something far more sinister than a shelter. On August 28, 1984, Fritzl asked Elisabeth to help him install a heavy door in the basement. When she came down, he covered her mouth with a cloth soaked in chemicals, and she lost consciousness. When Elisabeth woke up, she was in the hidden cellar, restrained and unable to move freely. For months, her father visited regularly, keeping her confined and isolated from the world above. He removed the restraints only half a year later. After Elisabeth's disappearance, her mother filed a police report. But a month later, a letter arrived at the family's home. In it, Elisabeth wrote that she was safe, living with a friend in another city, and asked them not to search for her, or she would leave the country for good. Joseph told the police that his daughter had joined a religious group. No one questioned his story. She was legally an adult, and she had run away before. His explanation seemed credible enough. During the first years, Fritzl visited his daughter every few days, bringing her food and supplies. Her notes later described life underground with chilling simplicity. The light goes off, mould. The light comes on, and the nightmare continues. The light goes out, damp walls, mould. The light comes back on, and the nightmare continues. In the underground room there were rats. During winter the air was icy and wet. In summer, the low ceiling trapped the heat, turning the space into a suffocating furnace. There were no windows, no clocks, and at times, no electricity. When Joseph wanted to punish Elisabeth, he would simply cut the power for several days. For the first 4 years, she lived completely alone. Everything changed in early 1988, when Elisabeth realized she was expecting a child. Fritzl was disturbingly calm about it, even excited. Before the birth, he brought her an old medical manual, a few towels, a pair of scissors, disinfectant, and some baby supplies. On August 30th, 1988, Kirsten was born. A year and a half later came Stefan. But when Elisabeth became pregnant again in 1992, Fritzl decided that one more child could not stay underground. The room had grown too small, too stifling. On the morning of May 19, 1993, a cardboard box appeared on the Fritzl doorstep. Inside was a 9-month-old baby girl, and a letter allegedly written by Elisabeth. In it, she asked her parents to take care of her daughter Lisa, promising to contact them soon. That same day, Joseph went to the Amstetten Youth Welfare Office. He told officials about the discovery, showed them the letter, and even brought a few of Elisabeth's old school notebooks so that handwriting experts could confirm its authenticity. He insisted he only wanted to be sure that the child was truly his granddaughter. Lisa was frail. At 9 months old, she weighed barely 5.5 kilograms. Yet the examining doctor reported that she appeared healthy and had clearly been born in a hospital. Her umbilical cord had been cut with professional precision, and she was clean and well cared for. It remains unclear whether the police ever tried to determine in which hospital Lisa had been delivered, though records suggest some attempt was made to trace her mother. 5 days after Lisa's discovery, youth welfare officers visited the Fritzl home and wrote in their report that the grandparents had recovered from the initial shock, accepted the child, and were caring for her properly. 6 months later, another report noted that Lisa had formed a close bond with her grandparents, that she was loved, and that she seemed happy and secure. In December 1993, legal custody of the child was officially granted to Joseph and Rosemary Fritzl. Joseph told the court he would return Lisa to her mother as soon as Elisabeth reappeared and could prove she was living responsibly. The plan had worked, and so he used it again. A year later, another baby carriage appeared outside the Fritzl home. Inside was a 9-month-old girl named Monica. That night, the phone rang. Rosemary picked up the receiver and heard her daughter's voice. It sounded distant, mechanical, as if pre-recorded. What unsettled her even more was that Elisabeth somehow knew their new phone number. Once again, the Fritzls reported the abandoned child to both the police and the youth welfare authorities. Before long, custody of Monica was granted to them as well. The third child Fritzl brought upstairs was a boy named Alexander, about 18 months old. He explained to officials that the religious group his daughter had joined did not allow children, and the inspectors, convinced by his calm demeanour, wrote warm reports describing the family's devotion. They wrote that the girls, Lisa and Monica, adored their new little brother, though sometimes grew jealous and asked when the baby would be taken back. The authorities noted that the children were healthy, well cared for, taking gymnastics classes, visiting the library, and learning to play musical instruments. To everyone around them, the Fritzls seemed like perfect grandparents. No one could have imagined that 2 more of their grandchildren were still living beneath the same roof, in darkness. Together with Alexander, another baby had been born, his twin brother Michael. He suffered from respiratory complications, and Elisabeth begged her father to take him upstairs to get help. Joseph refused. 3 days later, Michael died in the basement. Fritzl quietly disposed of the remains, leaving no trace, and no one ever suspected what had happened in that silent, hidden world below. Elisabeth's 7th child, Felix, was born on December 16, 2002. Joseph understood that his aging wife would no longer be able to care for another baby, and so he decided to keep Felix in the basement, which by then he had expanded. Over the years, Fritzl forced his daughter and her children to dig out more space with their bare hands. Despite the inhuman conditions they lived in, Elisabeth tried to be a good mother. She taught her children to read and write, invented small games to keep their minds active, and turned learning into a way to survive. Their only connection to the outside world, and the only means by which the children could imagine what that world looked like, was an old television. Simple things like forests, mountains, animals or cars seemed to them like scenes from a science fiction film. After Elisabeth pleaded with him for months, Fritzl finally brought them an ultraviolet lamp and vitamin D tablets to compensate for the lack of sunlight. To him, everything that happened appeared normal. He brought his daughter flowers, his grandchildren soft toys and books. Together, they decorated a small Christmas tree, celebrated holidays, and watched family movies on the old TV. But his cruelty never disappeared. He continued to dominate and humiliate Elisabeth, often turning moments that should have been ordinary into displays of control and punishment. Whether Elisabeth ever tried to escape with her children is unknown. Even if she had, they could not have broken through the reinforced concrete door with its coded lock. Josef warned them that he could release gas into the basement if they ever attempted to harm him or flee. Later investigations would show this was a bluff. There was no gas system installed. Did no one close to Fritzl ever find it strange how much time he spent in the basement? He claimed it was his private workspace and strictly forbade anyone from entering. No one in the household dared to ask what exactly he was doing there. His daughter-in-law later said that Josef told the family he was drawing technical sketches for the machines he sold. Rosemary, his wife, never asked questions. A quiet, obedient homemaker, she was for Josef the perfect spouse, one who never interfered, tolerated his coldness, and never objected to his frequent trips to Thailand, where he sought company and escape. Before such trips, he stocked the basement freezer with enough food to last weeks. Once, he left for an entire month. During that time, a power outage shut off the freezer, flooding the already damp cellar with melting water. Tenants who rented rooms in the Fritzl house often complained about strange noises coming from below. Josef always had an explanation: rattling pipes, heating problems, and under threat of eviction forbade anyone from going down there. One of the tenants was a young man named Leitner, a friend of Elisabeth's who had moved into the house back in 1990. He never heard unusual sounds, but he did notice something odd. The electricity bills were abnormally high. The meter kept running even when the house was empty. Leitner's dog Sam also seemed uneasy, barking persistently at the basement door. When Fritzl noticed this, he immediately evicted the tenant and changed the locks. Neighbours saw him carrying groceries to the basement in the evenings, but no one thought much of it. In a reserved Austrian town, people preferred not to pry. He bought clothing for his captives in other cities, and his frequent business trips raised no suspicion. Fritzl owned several guest houses that required constant supervision. Social workers rarely visited. Occasionally they called the house, but in later years, even those calls stopped. As time went on, Fritzl's interest in his daughter faded. She reminded him too much of his wife. Maintaining the underground world grew harder for him physically. He began to consider letting them go. But first he planned a deal. He told Elisabeth that once freed, she and her children would have to confirm the story that they had lived all these years within a religious group. He would then appear as their rescuer, the devoted father who had risked everything to save them. That plan might have worked, but it was undone by Kirsten's illness. On the evening of April 18th, 2008, 19-year-old Kirsten suddenly became gravely ill. She had suffered from health problems before, but this time the situation was life-threatening. Her body convulsed, her lips bled from repeated biting, and she slipped in and out of consciousness. Elisabeth begged her father to take the girl to a hospital. By the next morning, when Kirsten lost consciousness completely, Josef finally agreed to call for medical help. Together, they carried the young woman upstairs. For the first time in 24 years, Elisabeth saw daylight. Moments later, her father ordered her to return to the basement, to the other children. On the 7th day of Kirstin's stay in the hospital, Fritzl waited until Rosemary and the other children had left the house, and then he released his captives. With Elisabeth and Kirstin had lived 2 boys, Stefan, 18, and Felix, 6. When they stepped outside, Felix knelt in the garden, running his hands through the grass, laughing and clapping. He and his brother stared at the moon, startled by the sound of cars, and struggled through their first elevator ride. The boys had limited speech and motor skills. Stefan, in particular, suffered from severe spinal deformities. All his life he had been forced to stand hunched under the basement's low ceiling, a posture that left permanent damage. Police were alerted by the hospital when Josef Fritzl, identified as Kirstin's grandfather, arrived to visit her, accompanied by a pale, fragile woman. Why, after so many years, had he taken such a risk? When officers arrived, they learned that the woman's name was Elisabeth Fritzl. Doctors and police were shocked by her appearance. Her skin was grey-pale, her hair thin, and many of her teeth were gone. At 42, she looked decades older. Elisabeth was initially detained under suspicion of neglect. At that time, authorities already knew about her other children, the ones who had mysteriously appeared on the family's doorstep years earlier. At first, Elisabeth refused to speak, especially while her father was present. But once he was asked to leave the room, she looked at the officers and quietly asked if they could promise her something: that neither she nor her children would ever have to see him again. When the detectives assured her of their protection, she began to tell her story. Elisabeth explained that she had not been held by any religious sect, as her father claimed, but had been kept captive by Josef Fritzl, the very man who had brought Kirstin to the hospital, her own father. Over the course of those 24 years, he had subjected her to systematic abuse and control, leaving her completely isolated from the world above. She told investigators that she had given birth to 7 children during her captivity. One of them had died shortly after birth. In total, Elisabeth had spent 8,516 days underground. She had not seen the sun, breathed fresh air, or known the passage of seasons, tracking time only through the growth of her children. How she managed to stay sane was something neither the doctors nor the investigators could fully comprehend. When her interview was over, officers immediately went to the Fritzl residence, 40 Ibstrasse, Amstetten. They struggled at first to find the entrance to the hidden space. It was concealed behind rows of tools in the workshop. A small metal door, barely a metre high, secured with a coded lock. The door weighed around 300 kilograms, reinforced with concrete, and slid open on steel rails. There were 8 doors in total, leading to the underground complex, each sealed with its own lock. When detectives finally passed through the last one, they entered a space of about 60 square meters. It resembled a small apartment: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a shower, a storage area and a communal room. Something between a dining area and a living space. The rooms were connected by a narrow corridor, so tight that an adult could barely pass through. The soundproofing was thorough, and there was ventilation, but insufficient for the number of people who had lived there. After verifying Elisabeth's testimony, police arrested the 73-year-old Josef Fritzl and charged him with severe crimes committed against his own family. After Elisabeth's testimony, and the search of the Fritzl home. Elisabeth, her 6 children, and Josef's wife Rosemary were placed under protective custody. Rosemary was in a state of shock. She cried, hugged her daughter and grandchildren, and insisted to the police that she had never suspected what had been happening in her own home. Friends and acquaintances reacted much the same way. To them, Josef had always appeared as a gentle, affectionate grandfather, polite, cheerful, and devoted to his family. A few days later, DNA testing confirmed what Elisabeth had already said. Josef Fritzl was the biological father of all of her children. The accused immediately hired an attorney, who claimed that the police still had to prove his guilt in what he called alleged acts of abuse and captivity. It was difficult to believe that one elderly man could have built and maintained such an elaborate underground structure alone for more than 2 decades. Investigators did not rule out the possibility of an accomplice, but after a detailed forensic examination of the basement, they found no evidence suggesting that anyone else had been involved. Over the course of the investigation, police interviewed nearly 100 people: tenants who had lived in the house, Fritzl's colleagues and his acquaintances. Many described him as a talkative old man who enjoyed beer, told inappropriate jokes, and laughed loudly. Others, however, painted a darker picture. Neighbours said he could be cruel toward his family, and a man who once stayed at his lakeside campground called him cold and unfriendly. During his first interrogation, Josef Fritzl denied any wrongdoing, claiming that his relationship with Elisabeth had been consensual. Later, he changed his account, admitting that he had intended to make her completely dependent on him ever since she was a disobedient teenager. He compared his obsession to an illness, something he said he could not control. Psychiatrist Adelheid Kastner, who examined Fritzl, saw the situation very differently. She described him as a calculating, emotionally detached individual with strong narcissistic traits. According to Kastner, Fritzl's narcissism was collector-like. He viewed people as possessions, trophies to be displayed and controlled. He took pleasure in observing his victims, in the sense of power it gave him, and in reducing others to instruments for his own needs. Kastner diagnosed him with borderline, schizotypal, and paraphilic personality disorders, and recommended compulsory psychiatric treatment. However, despite the psychiatrist's conclusion, Fritzl was deemed legally sane and fit to stand trial. The case attracted enormous media attention. Newspapers and television networks across Europe followed every development. One day, among the viewers of a news report about the case was another woman, a nurse who recognized the man on the screen as the one who had attacked her in 1967. When she came forward and spoke to journalists, the public finally learned about Fritzl's first conviction decades earlier. Neither the police nor the officials who had later allowed him to adopt 3 of Elisabeth's children had been aware of that prior offence. Under Austrian law, criminal records are automatically expunged 15 years after a sentence is served. Detectives also investigated whether Fritzl could have been involved in other unsolved crimes, including the killings of Martina Claudia Posch, Anna Neumeier, and Gabriela Supikova, whose bodies had been found near lakes where Fritzl's family had vacationed, or near one of his properties. But no direct evidence connected him to those cases, and none were included in the final indictment. In the end, the charges focused on the prolonged captivity and abuse of his daughter and grandchildren, along with unlawful imprisonment, coercion, and the death of the infant Michael, the twin brother of Alexander. Experts concluded that Michael's life could likely have been saved had he received timely medical care. On March 16, 2009, Joseph Fritzl appeared before the court. He entered the courtroom with his face hidden behind a blue folder and sat with his back to the jury and the press. Reporters were soon asked to leave. The proceedings were declared closed due to the victims' ages and the sensitive nature of the crimes. His defense attorney, Rudolf Meyer, urged the jurors to remain objective and not be guided by emotion. He portrayed Fritzl as a man who, in his words, had cared for two families, providing for them financially and even celebrating holidays with them. Meyer pointed out that Fritzl had brought a Christmas tree to the basement, and once even given the children a canary. Fritzl himself described his actions as an attempt to protect Elisabeth from bad influences, from alcohol, drugs, and the wrong company. He denied responsibility for Michael's death and for unlawfully detaining his daughter and her children. The prosecution was led by Christiane Bergheiser, who presented the full extent of the case against him, one that would soon become known around the world as one of the darkest chapters in modern Austrian history. As the trial continued, prosecutor Christiane Bergheiser took the floor. Using a laser pointer, she showed the jury the height of the ceilings in Joseph Fritzl's basement, just 1 meter and 74 centimeters. To help them understand the reality in which Elisabeth had lived for 24 years, Bergheiser invited the jurors to smell items recovered from the cellar. They carried the scent of dampness and decay, a heavy odour of mould and confinement. The testimony of Elisabeth Fritzl was presented by video recording. The detectives kept their promise. She would not have to face her father again. Her account lasted 11 hours, spread over several days of hearings. Listening to it was unbearable. Elisabeth described in detail the conditions she had endured for 24 years. The constant humiliation, the beatings, the relentless pattern of control and abuse. At the end, she said that she hated her father and wished that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Elisabeth's older brother, Harold, also testified. He confirmed his sister's story, recalling that during their childhood, she had been assaulted by their father and that he himself had often been beaten. Rosemary and Elisabeth's children chose not to testify. On March 18th, a woman entered the courtroom and quietly took a seat among the spectators. Out of everyone present, only Joseph Fritzl seemed to notice her. When their eyes met, his face changed. He went pale and began to cry. The woman, who had carefully concealed her appearance, was Elisabeth. Her unexpected presence became the turning point of the entire trial. The next day, Fritzl admitted his guilt on all counts and expressed what he called remorse. On March 19, 2009, Joseph Fritzl was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. He did not appeal the verdict and stated that he expected to spend the rest of his life in prison. The case of Joseph Fritzl was reported not only by the Austrian media, but by journalists across the world. The small town where the trial took place was overwhelmed by the international press. While local authorities tightened security, businesses saw opportunity in the sudden attention. Hotel prices quadrupled. Bar owners petitioned to sell alcohol around the clock. One diner even added a dish to its menu called the Fritzl Schnitzel. But the main point of fascination for reporters was Amstetten, Fritzl's hometown. The street where his house stood was lined with broadcast vans and television crews. The entrance to the cellar was fenced off and equipped with alarms, but that did not stop attempts to break in. Producers offered up to €1 million to the family for exclusive footage of the underground rooms. Neighbours were offered smaller but still substantial sums for photographs taken from their property. None of these deals ever happened. In the press, journalists also noted a chilling coincidence. In the 1940s, Amstetten had been a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp. British media drew uncomfortable parallels between Fritzl's neighbours and the Austrian population during the Second World War. Both, they suggested, preferred not to know what horrors were taking place just beyond their walls. Inside Austria, journalists criticised the Catholic Church, accusing it of supporting traditional family structures that, in their view, often protected authoritarian husbands and fathers, men like Josef Fritzl. In response to the growing criticism, the Austrian government launched a campaign to improve the country's image abroad. Chancellor Alfred Gusenbauer stated that he would not allow an entire nation to become a hostage to one man, insisting that Fritzl's crime was not an exclusively Austrian phenomenon. He was, however, speaking in the shadow of another national trauma. Just 2 years before the Fritzl cellar was discovered, another Austrian survivor, Natascha Kampusch, had escaped captivity after 8 years imprisoned in a small underground room. Her case had shocked the country, and now, this new revelation forced Austrians to confront the possibility that such horror could happen again. In the years that followed, similar crimes were uncovered elsewhere in the world. In 2013, in the United States, Ariel Castro was arrested after holding 3 women captive for a decade. One of them had given birth to a child during that time. In 2019, a couple from California received life sentences for keeping 13 people, including their own children, confined in their home. Under Austrian law, Josef Fritzl was permitted to choose the institution where he would serve his sentence. Among the options were 3 facilities with specialised psychiatric sections. He selected Garsten Prison, a former monastery located at the foothills of the Alps, just 30 minutes from Amstetten. Considered one of the most comfortable prisons in Austria, Garsten offered education programs, choir practice, and sports activities. Fritzl spent his days in a single cell, reading books and watching television. He was held under increased security, but that did not prevent other inmates from attacking him several times. During one such assault, he lost several teeth. In 2017, a dating profile appeared online under Fritzl's name. The revelation caused public outrage, and to stop the harassment, the authorities forced him to change his surname. Even in prison, Josef continued to make provocative statements. In one of his last interviews, he suggested that people should look into the basements of others, claiming that there were likely more hidden captives around the world. Over time, Fritzl's health deteriorated. He grew frail and began to lose hope of ever being released. But everything changed in the autumn of 2021, when prison psychiatrists unexpectedly declared him no longer dangerous to society and recommended his transfer to a regular facility. The court approved the move, and in January 2024, exactly 15 years after his sentencing, Joseph applied for early release and requested to be moved to a nursing home. His request was denied. Nevertheless, his new attorney Astrid Wagner, who had once defended another notorious Austrian criminal, Jack Unterweger, stated publicly that Fritzl's release was only a matter of time. Now 90 years old, Joseph suffers from advanced dementia. He is weak, rarely leaves his cell, and spends most of his days in silence. In recent years, he has begged both his wife and daughter for forgiveness, asking them to visit him before he dies. Neither Rosemary nor Elisabeth has responded. Authorities feared, with good reason, that the Fritzl house might one day become a morbid tourist attraction. After several incidents in which local teenagers were caught holding secret parties inside the cellar, officials decided to fill the underground chambers with concrete. Initially, the town planned to demolish the house entirely, but later it was put up for sale. Buyers did not appear immediately. For several years, the cottage served as a homeless shelter, and later as a refugee hostel. Finally, in 2016, it was purchased and converted into modern apartments. Kerstin, Elisabeth's eldest daughter, the one whose illness had led to their rescue, spent several weeks in critical condition, but eventually recovered and was reunited with her family. Adjusting to life outside took time. Loud sounds triggered panic attacks in both Kerstin and her brother Stefan. They were diagnosed with malnutrition, anemia, and severe vitamin D deficiency. At first, they showered up to 10 times a day and struggled to eat solid food. Anything with a strong taste seemed inedible to them. In the first months after Joseph's arrest, the family lived under the protection of a counter-terrorism police unit. After the verdict, they took new names, left Amstetten, and moved into a new home provided by the government. Over time, tensions arose between Elisabeth and her mother Rosemary, and their relationship became strained. A reminder that even after liberation, healing from such darkness would take more than a lifetime. Elisabeth often blamed her mother for being weak-willed, for believing too easily in Joseph's story about a religious sect. In time, their relationship grew so strained that Rosemary was forced to leave. Elisabeth devoted herself entirely to her children. She took them hiking, swimming, and spent countless hours helping them discover the world that had once been denied to them. One day, however, their sense of safety was shattered when a paparazzo broke into their home, the location of which had until then been kept secret. The family was forced to return to therapy, and their new house was equipped with surveillance cameras and 24-hour security. The residents of the small village where they lived formed a volunteer patrol, keeping journalists and strangers away from Elisabeth and her children. Gradually, life began to settle into something resembling normal. Elisabeth started a relationship with one of her bodyguards, Thomas Wagner, a man 23 years younger than she was, someone who, in many ways, became an older brother figure to her children. The state awarded the family around €60,000 in compensation and provided a monthly allowance. In time, Elisabeth reconciled with her mother and re-established contact with the children who had grown up under Rosemary's care. As for those who had spent their childhood underground, the press later wrote that Stefan dreamed of becoming a merchant ship captain. Kerstin eventually married, and Felix, 5 years later, no longer remembered the years he had spent in the cellar. This was the story of Joseph Fritzl, a reminder that true evil rarely hides in the shadows. It lives quietly, behind closed doors, sustained by silence and denial. This was one of those stories that reminds us how terrifying the human mind can be. Thank you for staying until the end. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me, whose shadow should I bring into the light next?